Manchester City is one of the biggest clubs in world football. But behind the trophies sits something far bigger, a football empire stretching across the globe. And Manchester City is only the center of it. But this story begins long before the billions. Before Guardiola, before the Etihad. For generations, Manchester City was something very different, a proud, unpredictable club living in the shadow of its neighbor. But before the money, the trophies and the global empire, Manchester City knew what it felt like to fall. By the late 1990s, they had dropped into the third tier of English football. For a club that once stood among England's biggest names, this was rock bottom. Then, in 2008, everything changed. Manchester City was bought by the Abu Dhabi United Group, backed by Sheikh Mansour. Suddenly, a club that had once fallen into English football's third tier had access to resources few clubs in the world could match. But the ambition wasn't simply to buy better players. Something much bigger was beginning. The message came almost immediately. On the same day the takeover was announced, City shocked football by signing Brazilian superstar Robinho for a British record transfer fee. Suddenly, Manchester City wasn't just spending money. They were announcing themselves to the football world. But the biggest investment wasn't happening in the transfer market. City began building for the long term, investing hundreds of millions into the Etihad Campus, training facilities and one of football's most ambitious academies. This wasn't just about building a winning team. It was about building an entire football system. Then came the moment that changed everything. May 2012, the final day of the Premier League season. City needed a win, and deep into stoppage time, the title was slipping away. Then Sergio Aguero scored. In seconds, decades of waiting disappeared. Manchester City were champions of England for the first time in 44 years. The project finally had its defining moment. Behind the scenes, the ambition was becoming much bigger. In 2013, City Football Group was created, turning one football club into the foundation of a global network. The idea was bold: build clubs across different continents, connected by the same ownership, expertise, scouting and football philosophy. And then the map began to fill. New York, Melbourne, Girona, Mumbai, and clubs across Europe, Asia and the Americas. Manchester City was no longer simply a football club. It had become the center of a global football network. Players, scouts, data, coaching ideas and commercial expertise could now move through an ecosystem spanning the world. But owning clubs around the world created something even more valuable: a global network for finding talent. Scouts, analysts and data could now be shared across continents. A promising player discovered in one market could be tracked, analyzed and developed inside the same football ecosystem. City weren't just building a team anymore. They were building a machine designed to find tomorrow's stars before everyone else. But football still begins with someone seeing something others might miss. A scout watching a young player on a small pitch can now plug that observation into a network far bigger than one club. If the talent is real, City Football Group has something most teams don't: multiple places to develop that player, test him, and move him along the pathway. And this is where City Football Group becomes something bigger than a collection of clubs. A young player can be discovered in one part of the world, developed in another, tested in a different league, all without ever leaving the same football network. For City, talent no longer had borders. But the real power of the network wasn't just moving players between clubs. It was information. Scouting reports, performance data, tactical analysis and development insights could be shared across the group. Instead of every club learning alone, City Football Group was building a system where knowledge gathered in one part of the world could create an advantage somewhere else. Then came the appointment that completed the transformation. In 2016, Pep Guardiola arrived in Manchester. But City hadn't simply hired the world's most wanted coach. They had spent years building an entire football operation capable of supporting his ideas. The infrastructure was ready. The recruitment system was ready. The ambition was already global. Now they had the manager to bring it all together. And eventually, the machine delivered its ultimate prize. In 2023, Manchester City finally won the Champions League, completing a historic treble. But this moment represented far more than one extraordinary season. 15 years after the takeover, the investment, infrastructure, recruitment and football philosophy had converged. Manchester City had reached the summit of European football. But by then, Manchester was only one piece of something much bigger. Because Manchester City was no longer just a football club, it had become the centerpiece of a global football business, one stretching across continents, connecting clubs, players, supporters, sponsors and commercial markets. The trophies made City famous. But behind them was something potentially even more valuable, a football network built to operate at global scale. And the model is built on more than matchday income. Broadcasting, sponsorships, merchandise, digital media and player trading all feed the wider business. The advantage of the group is scale: more clubs, more markets, more supporters and more opportunities to create value from the same football ecosystem. And this is where the network becomes incredibly powerful. City Football Group can identify talent early, develop players across different clubs and leagues, and create pathways that a single club simply couldn't offer. Some eventually reach Manchester City. Others are sold for significant profits. Either way, the player becomes more than a signing. They become an asset inside a global football system. And once that system works, the ambition changes. Manchester City is no longer operating like one football club. Scouting, data, coaching knowledge and commercial strategy can move across an entire network. A discovery in one country can create an opportunity in another. And that may be the real genius of City Football Group. They didn't just build a successful team. They built a football machine designed to scale. And this is what Manchester City ultimately became. Not simply a club transformed by money, but the centerpiece of a much bigger idea. Football success created attention. Attention created commercial power. And that power helped build infrastructure, develop talent and expand a network across the world. The trophies are what everyone sees. But behind them sits one of the most sophisticated business models football has ever created. But the bigger Manchester City became, the more questions followed. Their rise brought unprecedented success, but also unprecedented scrutiny. Questions over spending, sponsorships and football's financial rules would follow the club for years. City have consistently defended their position. And suddenly, the story wasn't only about what they had built, but whether football was comfortable with how they built it. Because behind the trophies and record revenues, another battle was taking place. Regulators began examining how Manchester City's success had been financed, from sponsorship agreements to the way revenue was reported. City have repeatedly denied wrongdoing and defended the legitimacy of their business. But the questions raised something much bigger: how far should money be allowed to reshape football? And through all of the noise, the football never stopped. The Etihad kept filling, the biggest players kept arriving, and Manchester City kept competing for the biggest trophies in the game. Because this is what makes the story so complicated. Behind the headlines are millions of supporters who simply fell in love with a football club. And on nights like these, the business disappears, and all that remains is football. And perhaps the clearest sign of City's ambition can be found far beyond Manchester. The same ideas, scouting, coaching, data and player development, can now move between clubs, countries and continents. A young player discovered in one part of the world can suddenly have a pathway into an entire football network. Manchester City didn't just build a successful team. They helped build a system designed to produce success again and again. And eventually, the investment delivered the one trophy that had always remained out of reach. In 2023, Manchester City became champions of Europe, completing a historic treble and reaching the summit of club football. 15 years earlier, this would have seemed almost impossible. Now, City weren't trying to catch football's biggest clubs anymore. They had become one of them. In 2008, Manchester City was bought with the ambition to transform a football club. What followed became something far bigger, a global network of clubs, talent, data, infrastructure and commercial power. You can debate what that transformation means for football, but one thing is difficult to argue: Manchester City didn't just change who wins the game. They helped change the business of the game itself. If you love football stories, subscribe. The next story begins soon.